Greetings, everybody. Welcome. Please take a seat. My name is Navina Haider, and I am the head of the Department of Islamic Art. It's my great pleasure, on behalf of all of my colleagues, to welcome everybody here today to a set of lectures organized in honor of Charles K. Wilkinson. And this is a great annual platform that we look forward to every year, because it allows us an afternoon to spend thinking about different topics of interest selected by the three departments that are most associated with this, with Wilkinson's legacy at the Met, and that's the Department of Egyptian Art, the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art, and the Department of Islamic Art. We are meeting now after 3 years, meeting in person after 3 years, because we had all the COVID interruptions that others had too. We were able to meet online once in between, but finally we're back in this wonderful space, and we also welcome our online audience, which has grown a lot in this period. So the theme this year is Worlds in Miniature. We chose this theme, 3 years ago, as I mentioned, or a long time ago, even before that, and I'm very, very grateful to our lecturers who have stuck with this, with us, and promised to speak about this subject in relation to their fields for all this time. So we're very, very privileged to be able to hear them today. We warmly acknowledge and thank the friends of Charles K. Wilkinson, as they were the ones who endowed the fund that yearly supports this event, where scholars who specialize in the topics covered by our three departments, Islamic Art, Egyptian Art, and Ancient Near Eastern Art, where he worked, share their experience focused on a single topic. Charles K. Wilkinson was an important member of the Met staff from 1920 until 1987, an amazing 66 years. After first joining the Met in 1920, Wilkinson spent 11 years working as a graphic artist, copying ancient Egyptian tomb paintings, many of which are still on view in Gallery 135, the facsimile gallery immediately outside of this auditorium. Wilkinson was appointed curator of the then Department of the Ancient Near East in 1956 and continued in that position when it was merged with Islamic Art in 1959. He served as the chair of both departments until his retirement in 1963. He was also an adjunct professor of Islamic Art at Columbia University, and as well, he was the curator of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Brooklyn Museum. His publication on the wall decorations from Nishapur is still a highly regarded study of that site. So the structure of our lectures will be that each department, each speaker fielded by each department will speak on the hour, and then depending on when they finish, we might have a small break of time before the next speaker starts. And with that, I welcome all of you to an afternoon of engagement, of interesting discussion and topics. There will be a question and answer, hopefully, session at the end if we have time. So much to enjoy. Welcome everybody, and I now invite my colleague Diana Patch from the Egyptian department to introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana Craig Patch, the Lila Atchison Wallace Curator in charge of the Department of Egyptian Art, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Adela Oppenheim, a curator and a friend in the department, as the first lecturer in what today looks to be a very thought-provoking program. Adela received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, part of New York University, in 2008, with a dissertation about the interaction between the king and the gods as represented in relief of the Pyramid Temple of Senwosret III, a pyramid complex. She joined our department in 1988, and although she had been an intern already in the Department of Near Eastern Art. Since 1990, she has excavated every year at the pyramid complex of Senwosret III at Dashur under Curator Emeritus Dieter Arnold's direction. And in 2016, she became the director of that excavation. She has written and lectured extensively on Middle Kingdom art, and that research, along with her work at Dashur, gave her the opportunity to co-curate an exhibition with Curator Emerita Dorothea Arnold in 2015. That was called Ancient Egypt Transformed, the Middle Kingdom, which explored all aspects of art from about 2000 BC to 1640 BC. Although Adela continues to actively publish material based on her work at Dashur, she has recently become fascinated by tomb models, and today is going to share with us her new research on Middle Kingdom models from the tomb of the royal chief steward, Mecca Ray. Adela?
Thank you very much, Diana, for that very kind introduction. And welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and actually an honor to be participating in this lecture series. As was mentioned, I was actually here in the mid-1980s as an intern in the Ancient Near East Department, and I had the privilege of meeting Charles Wilkinson. And I was very young and didn't know very much. I'm not sure I know much more now, but I was very young and didn't know very much then. And I wish I had asked him more stories about his work in the earlier days of museum work in Egypt and in the Near East. But I did meet him, and I do remember him, and so it's an honor to be here today. And I just would also quickly like to thank Diana and the staff of the Education Department and all the people here in Grace Rainey. Is actually a bigger setup than one realizes, who have helped put this lecture together. And my thanks also go to Deaner Arnold, who has been listening to me for weeks now as I run into his office with a new idea about these models, and to Sarah Chen, who prepared, she helped me scan a lot of these things, and she did an amazing job. And then to Elizabeth Miller, our department administrator, who's been working very hard on getting this lecture together on behalf of our part of the department. So the tomb of Meketre, one of, I think oops, I should have done that. The tomb of Meketre, one of the more, I think, beloved collections of material in this museum, and especially if you've come here as a child, I think it's something that you always remember. It was discovered on March 17th, 1920. So 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the discovery, and we had planned some events around it, and we all know what happened. So no need to dwell on that, but here we are 3 years later, and going forward. So it's given me a little bit more time to think about this material. So first of all, we're going to situate Meketre in time and then in space. So this is the iconic picture of the Old Kingdom. The rough dates you see on the screen here. This is the age of the Great Pyramids. Meketre lived at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. There's a space between the Old and Middle Kingdoms. And then he lived, he served these two rulers. Dorothea Arnold's work has shown this. Originally, it was thought he only served Mentuhotep-Nephepet-Re II, who reunited Egypt after this period of disunity. If you saw the Middle Kingdom exhibition in 2015, he was greeting you when you entered the show. But we now know that Meketre's career continued even to the reign, probably only early in the reign of the pharaoh Amenemhat I. And you see his dates here on the screen. There were two smaller reigns in between. So this is where he is. He lives at the end of the 11th, the beginning of the 12th dynasty, the beginning of the Middle Kingdom period. This is an image of Meketre. Unfortunately, he's missing his head. But this comes from the cult temple of the pharaoh Mentuhotep-Nephepet-Re, and you see him here in a necklace presentation scene, and his names and some of his titles are here. So he was a high official whose roles changed during his lifetime. The titles included the chief royal treasurer, the chief royal steward, and the overseer of the seal. Not all these titles are presented on this relief, but we also have fragments of the decoration from his tomb. So this image did not come from his tomb. It came from the temple dedicated to the main king that he served. So So we know also about him from fragments of decoration from Meketre Ray's own tomb. Now, where was Meketre Ray? So at the top of the screen, the big red arrow, you see that's the area of Cairo. And also in the Old Kingdom, and then later in the Middle Kingdom, this was the sort of general vicinity of the Egyptian political capital. But at the beginning of the 11th dynasty, the part of probably the heart of Meketre Ray's career, power in Egypt was actually centered in the south, where you see this lower red arrow, in this area of Thebes. That is where Meketre Ray, as far as we know, lived all or most of his life and had the main part of his career, and that is where he was buried and made his tomb. So here you see a plan of the Thebes, which is modern Luxor. On the east bank here you have the Luxor temple, the huge Karnak temple to the north, and then on the west bank here you have, I can't quite see it, but the Valley of the Kings here, and then the mortuary temples, the so-called mortuary temples of the New Kingdom pharaohs here along the edge of the cultivation here. I'm probably not pointing to the right thing. Here is Malkata, where the Metropolitan Museum, under Diana's direction, has an excavation project. So Meketre Ray's tomb was actually where you see this red star, not too far from the temple of Mentuhotep Nebhepet-Re, in a deep wadi. And here you see the wadi, the approach to it. It was overlooking the tomb of probably what was the tomb of Amenemhat I, his first tomb, when he was still in the Luxor area. Amenemhat I eventually moved back to the Cairo area. So it's up here high on the cliff. And then this is the old photo that was taken by the Met's excavators. So throughout the course of this talk, I will be showing you some old black and white photos, because they show the tomb as it was discovered, as it was excavated, and in some cases they show things about the models that we don't have color photographs. So Meketre Ray's tomb was high up on a cliff, as you see, carved into the rock face. To have your tomb in a high position like this was very desirable because people would see it. So having a tomb in this kind of overlooking place was a mark of prestige. You see there was a long kind of causeway, or almost a kind of plaza, that led up to the tomb, and then there are two openings. So this central opening, it's centered on the causeway. This is the entrance to Meketre Ray's tomb. This secondary tomb is believed to be the burial place of his son Intef. And then for those of you who know our collection, here to the side was a member of Meketre Ray's household, a man named Wah, and he was buried here with some pretty spectacular objects that you can see also in our galleries today. So this is a plan. We're still using the plan that was made in the 1920s, showing this big causeway that you just saw with what they assumed was a columned portico, although architecturally and structurally I'm told there's some problems with how they've arranged this. This is the tomb of Wah, and then this is the tomb leading to the tomb of Intef, who is Meketre Ray's presumed son. And then here along the center axis is the corridor leading to Meketre Ray's tomb. So Meketre Ray's tomb had actually three parts. It had this long corridor with a chapel-like ending. This was all on ground level. So this was something you would be able to visit, even after Meketre Ray was buried there. And then there was a big shaft in the middle of this chapel, and it led to a really pretty small burial chamber here. But there was a second set of underground chambers, or a chamber. Here in the corridor, there was a hole in the floor and then a little bit in the wall. What is called here, we spell his name Meketre right now. This is the older spelling of his name. But here, there was a so-called serdab, and this is where the models were placed. So they were not placed next to his coffin. They were not in his burial chamber, but they were in this separate space. The burial chamber was robbed in ancient times, but the model chamber, the so-called serdab, was not. This is a view taken by the excavators at the time of the excavation. So from the entrance to the back, that's about 65 feet or 20 meters. And you see at the back of this picture, that's the shaft that leads down to his burial chamber. But if you see this ruler here, That's the opening of the chambers where the models were found. And this is how they were discovered. And I want to read a little bit of the quote from Herbert Winlock, who was the main excavator of, the main Egyptologist excavator, I should say, of this material, because it's a little bit old-fashioned, but it's very evocative. And he said Burton, meaning Harry Burton, the famous Tutankhamun photographer, pointed to a yawning black crack between the wall of the corridor and the rock floor. He said that he had tried to look in with matches, but they didn't give light enough, and told us to try the torches. At least a hole here was unexpected, but we had looked into so many empty holes, which we all who work in archaeology know that feeling. Anyway, I got down flat on my stomach, which we also all know, pushed the torch, meaning a flashlight, not a flaming torch, into the hole, pressed the button, and looked in. The beam of light shot into a little world of 4,000 years ago, and I was gazing down into the midst of a myriad of brightly painted little men going this way and that. A tall, slender girl, who you can see on the right there, gazed across me, perfectly composed. A gang of little men with sticks in their upraised hands drove spotted oxen. Rowers tugged at their oars on a fleet of boats, while one ship seemed foundering right in front of me. And you see that in the center, that sort of looks like the Titanic. It's with its sticking straight up in the air, with its bow balanced precariously in the air. And all of this busy going and coming was in uncanny silence, as though the distance back over 40 centuries I looked across was too great for even an echo to reach my ears. And then he goes on actually to explain how they found this. And I want to mention that because we always talk about the discoverer. So we say that it was discovered by the Metropolitan Museum and Herbert Winlock, but actually it was something that his Egyptian workmen noticed. They were actually really, and he doesn't name the person, but he said one of the men in this one had noticed, that one of the men he means by the Egyptians who were doing the physical digging, had noticed that the chips had an unaccountable way of trickling into a crack as fast as he dug. Unfortunately, he doesn't mention the name of this person, but that's actually, and it's to his credit that he mentions it at all. He wasn't the one who actually found it, but it was the very observant workmen who were in the tomb and concentrating on the removal, who actually found the secret to this unrobbed chamber. So here you see it more or less as they peered in. And these are a few photos showing how they found the models. So they were all stacked together, some cases piled on top of each other. This little chamber was about 3 meters square, that is 9 to 10 feet, and 125 to 150 centimeters high, which, for my American audience, is about 4 feet. So it was a place where they couldn't stand up. So here you see the boat models in the back, and then the granary in the front, which some of you probably know because that's one of the objects that's in our collection. And then as they cleared the models, and they were doing this apparently pretty quickly, because although we think it's all in perfect and beautiful condition, actually parts of the ceiling had collapsed in ancient times, and they were afraid because they had changed the atmosphere that it would collapse again. And apparently after they cleared the models out, it did. So they were nervous to get to do this as quickly but safely as possible. And so these are the scene models, what I call the box models, because they're sort of set into little boxes, which were stacked against one wall, and these were the last things that they removed. So the find altogether, it is not the largest find of these tomb models, but it is, I think, unarguably the finest. These models existed from the late Old Kingdom, wood models placed mostly into burial chambers. They existed from the late Old Kingdom till towards the end of the 12th dynasty. So they have a pretty long history and a lot of different interpretations, which we will talk about further. So altogether, the find included 8 of these house or box models, and you see the granary on the lower left. That is a weaver and carpenter shop, a stall for cattle, a slaughterhouse, a granary, a combined bakery and brewery, and 2 so-called gardens. Then there was one large board, which you see on the top there, with the so-called cattle count scene, with these cattle being paraded in front of Mecca Ray. 12 different kinds of boats, 2 large offering bearers, female figures. You see one on the right. She's currently actually in our Africa exhibition across the hall, and 1 offering bearer procession. At that time, the Egyptians allowed a division of fines, or so-called partage, and half of the models came here to the Metropolitan Museum. The unique models, like the cattle count, stayed in Egypt. So you can see them now in the Egyptian Museum Cairo and the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. So these models have a long history. This is another model, a boat model from the tomb of Jehudi at Lisht South, excavated by the Metropolitan Museum. It just gives you an idea. These are a little bit, just to say it cruder, the Meketre models, as I said, are particularly fine. And this is to show you how they can be found when they're actually in a tomb. On the left, this is a tomb at Bersha that was found about, 10 years ago, where the models were placed on top of the coffin and then with the statue to the side. And here on the right, the tomb of Wepwawet Emhat and from a suit, and with a statue that's not really a model, but a wood statue, and then their boats and some pottery that were found together in his tomb. So Herbert Winlock published this find in 1955, which remains the only time that they have been published as a group. They've been published individually in various things since then. Winlock actually died in 1950 at the rather young age, before he completed the volume on the models. He became director of the museum, and he had other responsibilities, so this kept him from finishing the publication. So he called this book The Models of Daily Life in Ancient Egypt, and that idea has permeated the studies of these 2 models. The original idea, which was maintained for a long time, which, as you will see, I am arguing against, is that these models represented daily life, that they were a kind of insurance policy if the walls of the tomb, which had similar kinds of decoration, were damaged. And that they represented things that the deceased would need in the afterlife, and you duplicated it. You had this on the wall of your above-ground tomb chamber, and then you had it underground as well. I don't think that that's actually the right explanation for these, as you will see. The more recent work has tended to try to home in on the fact that these models are placed in the burial chamber, and focusing on the fact that the deceased needed them closer to his coffin and closer to his mummified remains. But I'm not quite sure that that's it either. So, one problem with the models is that in Egyptian culture, there are certain themes that kind of permeate the culture, and we find them in different places in different ways, and one, I think, cannot assume that they always have the same meaning. And I think this sort of similarity sometimes in Egyptian visual culture obscures the fact that a similar kind of scene or similar actions maybe have different meanings in different contexts. The models, unlike wall scenes that you see on the left, this is actually a scene of cattle slaughtering from our tomb of Ra-Kai here in our collection. The wall scenes have inscriptions. The models very rarely do. So here you see the Meketre model also showing cattle slaughtering. And there are no inscriptions here to explain what's going on. In the wall decoration, we often have it, and that has led to some, I think, difficulties in trying to understand them. So Egypt is this little atmosphere shot. Egypt is a country, as we all know, dominated by the Nile River. In the Old and the Middle Kingdoms, the Egyptians did not have wheeled vehicles, and the Nile was really the principal means of transport up and down the country. So we also know that the Egyptians had the idea that ideally, in one aspect around the time of the funeral, one would travel maybe one's mummy, maybe a statue of oneself, and maybe also ideally during one's lifetime, one would travel to certain sacred cities. So these include so-called pilgrimages to places like Abydos, which is sacred to Osiris. This is more of a Middle Kingdom phenomenon. Up here in the Delta to Buto and Sais, and here to Heliopolis, which is a little bit north of modern Cairo. Meketre actually lived down here, so he was really in the southern part of the country, so any of these so-called pilgrimages, he would have been going north. But keep in mind, because remember this, it comes back a little bit later, if you're here in the Memphite Old Middle Kingdom capital area, you could go north and you could go south, depending on which way you were going. Now, in Egypt, the wind normally prevails from the north, from the Mediterranean, so when you go up the Nile, you're sailing, and when you go down the Nile, you're going with the current, because the Nile flows from south to north. So you can see in boats, if they have their sails out, they're going from north to south, and if they're rowing, they're going from south to north. Now, we tend to think of funerals as sort of single events, but they really have different components. And I was particularly struck, and I know some of my colleagues were, we were watching a few months ago the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. And not that it has anything really to do with ancient Egypt, but it was interesting to see the ceremonies around the commemoration of a monarch, much different than Egyptian monarchs, but nevertheless, it had some interest. So this actually consisted of various parts in which her coffin was moved to different locations. On the upper left, you see she was brought for the funeral service to Westminster Abbey, and then after the service, her coffin with all its regalia on top was moved out of the Abbey, and then she was brought to Windsor Castle down this long processional way, and then finally, at the bottom right, she was brought into the chapel at Windsor Castle for burial with her family. So there were different parts to this, which also involved moving to different locations. Oops. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong thing, sorry. So this is what I'm actually going to propose for the models of Meketre, that the group together represents one or more journeys that were probably the initial part of the funeral. In this case, we do not see Meketre's mummy, only what seems to be statues of him. So this image here is from an Old Kingdom tomb, a 5th dynasty tomb of a man named Ptahhotep, and it depicts a journey to one of the sacred places I showed you on the map, Sais, which is here represented at the top by these little chapels and these funny little things, which are actually supposed to be palm trees. They don't really look like palm trees, but that's what they're supposed to be. And the journey is setting off here. So this is the first question. They're going on a journey, Meketre. Where is he starting? And I think this provides a little bit of a clue here. In this lower left corner, the inscription says that they are leaving from the house of the weavers. This image has been published in a few places, this tomb, and there hasn't been a great understanding of what this house of the weavers means. Why are they leaving from a house of the weavers? But I think perhaps that this has maybe an oblique way, this is honestly, I have to say just my guess, of referring to the mummification process. So one of Meketre's models is in fact showing a weaver's shop. This is what model is in Cairo. It's right now in the Museum of Civilization. And linen was a very important part of the burial and the funerary suite. The mummy, of course, was wrapped in linen. But even the Meketre models themselves, you can see that these weavers actually themselves have little linen garments wrapped around them. So linen was deposited in the tombs as pieces of folded cloth. It wrapped the mummy. It wrapped the statues. It was a very key component of the burial. So it may be that here in referring to leaving from the house of the weavers, this is obliquely referring to the weavers' workshop, because this is, of course, part of the preparation of the mummy. And they maybe didn't want to specify the mummification place. That's a little bit of a guess on my part. What is often shown with weaving, and what is part of the preparation of the funerary suite are carpenters. So this carpenter's model the model of this carpenter shop is also in Egypt, and so I've included this here with the weavers, and you'll see that weaving and carpentry can be shown together on tomb decoration. So I've put these two together as being part of the place that they're leaving from. They're leaving from these workshops where elements of the funerary suite were fabricated. I actually thought that this big box in the middle here was the preparation of the coffin, and it even has this little seal on it. But in fact, that's apparently not true. I was wrong about this, because all the little tools that you see sitting on top of it were apparently inside it. So it's just it's a storage box, but it looks very coffin-like. But it is apparently not Meketre Ray's coffin. So I think from these workshops, they have prepared the material for the mummification and for the body and the burial, and this is where they're setting off on this journey, on this boat journey. Now, what's a little bit harder to place are the food production scenes, and that is the granary on the left, where the grain is being collected, and the model on the right, where they're making bread and beer. These are staples of the Egyptian diet, and these scenes are kind of ubiquitous of making different food products. So it is possible that here they are showing the preparation of food that would be needed for the journey, and it is possible that they are showing the preparation of a feast when they reach their destination. So I'm not sure exactly. I've put them here at the beginning of the journey, but it may be that they actually belong a little bit later. And these are the two models that we also have here in the museum, showing the feeding of the cattle, and then on the right, the end of the cattle, and also the roasting of birds. So we have here the four main Egyptian iconic food crops, that is bread and beer and cattle and fowl, being shown in these four models in very elaborate ways. I should mention here the slaughterhouse on the right. Dorothea Arnold, our curator emerita, has shown that this is probably not what an ancient Egyptian slaughterhouse actually looked like. That it probably did not take place the slaughtering did not take place in such an enclosed environment, but actually in an open courtyard. So she did really a very interesting study, not only about the slaughterhouse models, but about other models in the group, which has helped me a lot in my thinking about this material. So, of course, when we look at them, they have this charm of thinking, oh yes, now you get this little picture, like Winlock described in his text, of this mysterious and forgotten world, but they're not really necessarily all architecturally accurate. They're combining and convoluting certain things together. So this is a depiction of a wall scene. It's a little bit old-fashioned drawing, but it's got this nice black and white, so it's easy to see from a distance, of the tomb of Khnumhotep II from Beni Hassan. He lived a little bit after Mecca Ray. And this tomb was the subject of my colleague in the Egyptian department, Janice Cameron's dissertation. And she tried to look at these scenes of the wall decoration, and other people have done that, but she did this very well with this tomb, to say that they're not really daily life. We always think it's all daily life. No. This is actually showing, on the left here and on the right, the pilgrimage to and from Abydos. And it's explained in the inscription. And that's not something you would do in daily life. Here they're going to Abydos with the mummy being towed by the sailing boat, because from where they are in Beni Hassan, you would go south to Abydos, and they're bringing the mummy, and then here they're coming back, and the tomb owner is here. I hope I've got the right spot. Is here. And he's at the front of this boat, and he's been kind of transformed. He's not a mummy anymore. He looks, I have to admit, a little bit like a statue. But he's sitting upright, and there's no mummy on the return. So there's some kind of transformation that's happened in this pilgrimage. You can also see down here one of the very rare weaving scenes in relief. There's only 7 of them, and they only start in the Middle Kingdom. There's only 7. And next, below it, and also above, the carpentry. They don't say here that they've started out for this journey from the weaver's shop, or the house of the weavers. But the weavers are here. Unfortunately, this is the start of the journey. I have to admit this fact, that If it had been on this wall, it would have worked a little better for me. But they're building the boat here, so this must be the beginning of a journey, because they wouldn't need the boat when they came back, right? It was built before. So you have here building also materials for the tomb out of wood, more carpenters here and also up at the top, and then these weavers, and here they're washing the linen, the product of the weaver shop. So we have here this juxtaposition of linen and carpentry. And then this boat journey to Abydos, where the deceased individual seems to be transformed. So now we get to sort of the heart of the Meketre Ray models, which are all of these boats. So there are 4 boats that are they're called papyrus boats, not because they're made of papyrus necessarily, but because they have these papyrus umbels at the prow and the stern. And then there are 4 more boats. I'm not showing them all to you. There are 2, and there's another 2 that are not on the screen, and then we have another 2 here, and then they have another 2. So there are 8 altogether, 4 and 4. The papyrus umbel boats are a kind of sacred boat at the top, and then what's been called a traveling boat on the bottom, which is a little bit of a funny term because they all would have traveled, actually. So the question is, how do you mix, and I had a board in my office in the last weeks, I keep moving little pictures around. How do you move these 8 boats? Because these are the 8 boats that are undertaking the journey. Some are rowing, like the boats on the left, and some are sailing like the boats on the right. And the tendency has been to keep the sacred boats with these papyrus umbels together, and then the traveling boats, which have different images of Meketre Rays on all 8 of the boats. So to keep them in together, but I've actually changed my mind about that, and I am mixing them together. So here you see the tomb of Senet. This is a little bit after the time of Meketre Ray, and it's also a very detailed depiction of this Abydos journey with a little bit larger scale than the one in Beni Hassan. And here you see Intifikar and his mother Senet. They're going to Abydos. Here you see they're kind of all wrapped, kind of mummy-like and kind of statue-like. And here, this here actually is here on the left. It's one long image. And they're traveling to Abydos with another boat and then some different sacred objects, including a coffin. And then this is unfortunately the damaged return from Abydos. But you can see here, this is Senet. She's quite transformed. She's sitting in clothing, she's not in the stiff pose, and she's holding and she's sniffing a lotus flower. So she has, like in the scene at Beni Hassan, she's been transformed. And this is another scene from the tomb. And also you see at the top where they're bringing these little miniature statues and miniature sacred objects into the tomb. So for me now, the journey, the outbound journey, are these boats with the papyrus umbels, where you see Meketre Ray here, seated quite like a statue. There's been a lot of debates about whether he's really him or it's really a statue. This little kneeling figure is said to be his son, but there's no real way of proving that. And there are all kinds of actions that go on these boats in relation to Meketre Ray. They're censing his statue, they're reciting funerary formulas here, and then they're offering a leg of beef. So these are all actions you would perform on a statue. And the boat at the top on the right, this is also a sailing boat, but it's lost its sail. And this is also showing they're performing actions on what seems to be this statue of Meketre Ray. And then we get to the traveling boats. So I think that the papyrus umbel boats are probably showing 2 different journeys to 2 different sacred places. And then he returns on these so-called traveling ships, where you see him on the lower left. He's seated like Senet in this relaxed pose and sniffing the lotus flower. And here on the boat on the right, he's in the cabin, so he's a little bit hard to see, but these 2 figures are in this boat on the right. They're musicians, and they're singing, and they're playing music, so he's been transformed by this journey to 1 or more sacred places. Now, the problem is that from where Meketre Ray lived in Thebes, in Luxor, all these sacred places that we know of, most of them would have been to the north. So it wouldn't explain why you have the sacred boats with the papyrus umbles sailing and rowing. But Dorothea Arnold has shown, I think pretty convincingly, that there's a good chance that these models were actually not made where Meketre lived, but they were made, if you remember, I told you, remember the Memphite area near Cairo, that they were made there. It's too complicated for me to go into to explain this now, but she has, I think, explained pretty convincingly based on stylistic parallels that the models actually were probably made in the Memphite area and went to Meketre in Luxor. So with the people who made these models were probably not thinking about this problem, and they made sets going to the north from, not where Meketre lived, but from the Memphis area, and then to the south. So he's coming back here as a transformed person. He's made 2 journeys to 2 different sacred places. To the north of, both actually to the north of where he lived, but thematically encompassing the north and the south of the country. So I've only shown you actually half of these set of 8 boats. Then there are 2 more boats, which are called the kitchen boats. There are 2 of them. The one on the right is in Cairo, and I'm sorry because we don't really have good color images of them. And the one on the left is here in the Metropolitan Museum. And on these so-called kitchen boats, they are making bread and beer, and they are roasting meat. So there apparently is no fowl. But they're making the provisions for these journeys. And these boats also, the one on the right is sailing and the one on the left is rowing. So that seems to be part of, again, 2 different journeys. Now, what happens when they get there? So this is a good question because we have texts that talk about making this pilgrimage to a so-called pilgrimage to Abydos in these different places, but they don't explain what happens when you get there. So this is a little bit speculative. This is a little bit more speculative on my part. So 2 of the boats show scenes that seem to take place in a marshy environment. So one would think the delta. So this could be the journey to Budo or to Sais, those places in the north of Egypt in the delta where there are marshy lands. So this is a sporting boat, so-called sporting boat, where there are fish. There's fishing that's happened. There are fish here, and also fowl. You see this brace of fowl held by this female figure. And these are being brought to Meketre, who's still sitting here kind of statue-like. So this could be an activity because the fishing and the fowling is not just about bringing back food, but it also has a ritual aspect. And this boat is being studied by my colleague, Catherine Rarig, who actually thinks that the female figure here represents a goddess. So it has a sacred and a ritual character, probably some sort of ritual that took place in the delta. And then this really spectacular boat is in the Egyptian Museum and shows, Meketre is not shown here, but it shows these individuals on papyrus boats and they're catching fish. So I would suggest that this is part of the ritual of some kinds of rituals that went on in the delta as part of these journeys. And then the model, one of the models that you saw at the beginning was perched on top, it's a very long model, is this so-called cattle count. Now, the cattle count had ritual implications, had economic implications because it had to do with the wealth of the country, but it also had ritual ones. And we see here, and this kind of cattle parade, you wouldn't have necessarily needed to make this kind of complicated ceremony in order to count the cattle. You could count them in their stalls. You could count them in the fields if you were clever and kept track of them. They didn't move around too much. They're also, and this is something I noticed when I was preparing this talk, they're also all bulls, at least the ones in the front. The next time I'm back in Egypt, I have to look because you can't really see the ones in the back, but they all seem to be bulls. And Meketre is here under the pavilion, again looking kind of like a statue, with the kneeling figure who may be his son. And there are scribes here, so they're clearly making some kind of enumeration. There is some kind of counting happening here. But this cattle count also has a ritual nature. So this may be some sort of ritual, maybe for the journey in the other direction, maybe to Abydos, maybe to the south. We know that cattle counting can be part of a renewal ritual called the Sed Festival, which is performed by Egyptian kings. We have a New Kingdom tomb that talks about cattle being driven around a wall as also part of ritual. And there's this very conspicuous wall in the back, which may be part of the stability of the model, but I've wondered about that. That there were journeys involved with this cattle count. This is the tomb of Jehudi Hotep at Bersha, again, a little bit after the time of Meketre. It's famous for this statue dragging scene, but the bottom of the wall has this really, notice here also on the right, the tomb owner, he's sitting and watching all this. So this tomb has this really elaborate cattle counting scene, and with rows and rows of cows or bulls being brought to the tomb owner who was here on the right, and then these boats at the top. And then the inscription states that they are arriving at the hall of counting the cattle, implying a ritual aspect, also a journey. I can't imagine trying to move all these cattle, but that there's a ritual aspect to this cattle count. And now we'll arrive, finally, at the two so-called gardens. So these have traditionally been seen as the house of Meketre. There are two of them, and they are unique. One is here and one is in Egypt. They are unique. There are clay models which seem to show houses or perhaps tombs, but in wood and with, of course, this level of detail, but this kind of wooden model showing a portico, a covered portico with a copper basin surrounded by these sycamore trees, or really any tree. These two are really unique in the model repertoire. And these are not actually complete buildings, they're kind of summaries of the buildings. You're only seeing this paradisical kind of garden. And in fact, what's also interesting is that Winlock noted that he thought, based on the debris that they found and how the models were found, that one of them, and I'm not sure which one, had water in the pool when it was deposited in the tomb, as if some kind of ceremony had happened when they deposited it, which will be key in another minute, because I think I only have another minute. So at the back of the model, you see that there are three doors. This triple door complex is not something like this, is not something you really see in an Egyptian house, but it is something that is very characteristic of Egyptian Middle Kingdom temples. And on the right, this is a temple at Medinet Mahdi. It's a little bit later than Meketre, but here, and you even see the middle door is a little bit wider than the two on the side. And at the temple of Medinet Mahdi, it's a small temple, but it's really well preserved for a Middle Kingdom temple. You have a portico, and then another room, and then three statue shrines, of which the center one is the widest. So basically what I think is that these house models are not houses at all, but they're temples, and they are an abbreviated representation because you wouldn't show the sacred interior. They're an abbreviated representation of the places that Meketre was going. And here you see detail, which I've actually never seen, but the model that's in the Met, they had to take it apart because the trees needed conservation, and they were able to see the ceiling under the portico, and it has these stars. Ceiling stars are usually, although nothing in Egypt is ever 100%, which always trips us up. We always say, oh, it's like this, except for the one that's not. They're usually features of temples, and as far as we know, not private houses or non-royal tombs. So that again would argue that these are temples. There is an overlap in concept and some architectural forms between house, tomb, and temple, and there may be a certain ambiguity that was meant here. But I am maintaining now these are temples, shrines. This was also, I have to say, suggested by Dorothea. She saw them as a little bit different than I did, than I do now, but she also suggested that these were sanctuaries and not houses. So then we have this group of kind of offering bearer figures. The first one seems to be a priest holding a sacred vessel and an incense, and then the second one holding linen, and then we have the two female figures, again with bread, beer. I think they're missing the meat. They're holding the fowl and they're missing the meat. But they seem to be, I'm not quite sure where to fit them into this group, to be honest, how they work. They may be have some sort of a different kind of extraneous meaning. And then finally, because I can't leave them out, the two female figures, one of which Winlock described at the beginning of his description of how the tomb looked. So these two figures were at either end of the groups of models. They seem to anchor it. They don't represent actually living human beings, living women, but they're representing the estates that would bring the funerary offerings for Meketre, bread, beer, meat, and fowl. Both of them have together. And they're sort of the symbolic anchors of these tomb scenes. So this brings us now to the conclusion. Now, as you've seen, these ritual journeys are shown in tomb relief. And then they are placed as three-dimensional miniatures in the tomb itself. So in a way, you could say, well, you've just rolled around back to the beginning. You have things that are represented on the wall, and they have duplicates in the tomb, so what's the difference? You're just saying it kind of in a different way. But I think that the meaning of these models are something else. I think that if you imagine it, bringing your mummy or bringing even a statue to these different cities, it would be very complicated, it would be very expensive, it would be very time-consuming. Maybe you don't want to take the mummified individual out on a boat in the heat, I don't know. I mean, from the practical aspect, it has a lot of issues and complications. So what I would like to suggest is that these models are made in 3 dimensions because they enacted a ritual as a step in the funeral process. And these models made the journey for the deceased. That I can't really tell you how they did this, but that some kind of ritual was enacted in front of the tomb, maybe in that huge plaza that we saw in front of Meketre's tomb. And that they may have been made just for Meketre, they may have been something that had been used for a little while for other ceremonies before they were placed in the tomb. Catherine noticed when she looked at the sporting boat that there had been changes made to it, and Winlock noticed that there were damage to the sailing ships that he didn't think happened either when the tomb decayed or even when the models were placed in the tomb. So we know from other contexts that the ancient Egyptians, when something had a sacred use, a ritual use, that they kind of took on a magical power, and you couldn't just use them as, let's say, normal objects anymore. But then they would be buried because they weren't, let's say, safe to have anymore. So I think perhaps that's what happened with not just Meketre's models, which were a particularly elaborate set, but all of these tomb models, that they were used for funeral rituals to allow the deceased to magically make this journey, something that the wall decoration wouldn't do. And then they were buried, in Meketre's case, in a separate chamber. In other cases, actually in the next to the coffin. And this was how the deceased made his ritual journey as part of his burial. And I want to just conclude with a quote from one of Dorothea's articles, which sort of encapsulates this idea of the miniature world. And she said, there is a peculiar hush hovering over this miniature world, as if a magic performance were underway. Understandably, because a spell of life is being cast here in aid of human mortality. And thank you all very much.
Good afternoon, and welcome back. My name is Kim Benzel. I'm the curator in charge of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art here at the Met, and it is my great, great, great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Yelena Rakic, curator in the Met's Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. Yelena received her PhD in art history of art actually, at the University of Pennsylvania in 2003, writing a dissertation titled The Contest Scene in Akkadian Glyptic, a study of its imagery and function within the Akkadian Empire. Her research since then has focused heavily on the relationship between text and image on Mesopotamian monuments and other objects, including cylinder seals, from the 3rd millennium BCE. She's also interested in and deeply knowledgeable about the history of collecting material culture from ancient West Asia, along with the development of the canon and overall field of ancient Near Eastern studies in the United States. She recently published in the 2021 Metropolitan Museum Journal an article titled Collecting the Ancient Near East at the Met. Yelena has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Connecticut, Cooper Union, and at the CUNY Graduate Center, and has participated in archaeological excavations in Egypt, with Adela actually, Syria, and Jordan. Since joining the Meta staff in 2008, first as a research scholar, and from 2009 onwards until today as a curator, Yelena has worked on numerous exhibitions at the museum, written for and edited multiple catalogs associated with those exhibitions, and is currently an invaluable contributor to and the indispensable project manager, curatorial project manager for our department's major capital project to reimagine the permanent galleries for the art of from ancient West Asia, and that's due to open in 2026. Having known and worked with Yelena for over 30 years now, I can say without hesitation that she is one of the most brilliant and thoughtful researchers in our field, whose scholarly contributions are at the same time grounded and provocative, and whose work on provenance, as well as the historiography of the field, has been transformative. She's a colleague with unshakable integrity and ethics, and her generosity is seemingly endless. I'm also lucky enough to call her my friend. Please join me in welcoming Yelena to present her talk, Impressions of Ancient Mesopotamia, the Miniature Worlds of Cylinder Seals. I already messed up your title, so sorry. Yelena.
Good afternoon, everyone who's here with us today, and hello for all of you online at whatever your time zone might be. Let's just get situated. And thank you, Kim, for that thoughtful introduction and for your never-ending enthusiastic support for my research and for your friendship. And I also want to extend a big thanks to Lily Kustek for all your help organizing this Wilkinson Lecture Series, along with Elizabeth Miller and Helen Goldberg, and also to all the folks in our fabulous education department and staff here in Grace Rainey Auditorium. And while I never had the privilege of meeting Charles Wilkinson, my interest in the department and the history of the department, through that, I feel like I kind of know him, in fact. And I'm always happy when I have the opportunity to say how grateful I am in every way for my amazing colleagues in the A&E department. Anne, Chloe, Dara, Erhan, John, Kim, Lily, Michael, Sarah, Sean, and JF, who's our honorary staff member. Thank you. Oh, and I should have, of course, forwarded the slide. There we go. To begin, Worlds in Miniature, the theme for this year's Wilkinson Lecture Series, seemed custom-made in many ways, like an obvious prompt for a consideration of cylinder seals. Indeed, miniature is an adjective commonly invoked to describe these small-scale objects. I, however, was more compelled by the reference to worlds, and in thinking about a title for this talk, a number of idiomatic expressions featuring the word world came to my mind. Perhaps I could try the whole world in your hand, a clear reference to a seal's diminutive size. Or maybe the world is at your fingertips, a gesture to both the act of a hand rolling a seal on clay and the tactile nature of the materiality of the seal and the images carved into that material. Better yet, as the world turns, signaling the cylindrical shape of the seals, and I promise this is my only animated slide. In the end, I gave up on the idea of trying to be punny and instead decided on impressions of ancient Mesopotamia, the miniature worlds of cylinder seals. My use of the plural worlds is intentional. Cylinder seals provide multiple ways to access and think about the past, and in my mind, more importantly, the people who lived in the past. The literal impressions created when a seal is rolled onto clay are an apt metaphor for the seal's potential to provide insight to the worlds in which they operated and the multiple entryways into those worlds. It is the impression that makes visible the images carved into the matrix of the cylinder seal, a transformative process, and it is often those images which have captivated the modern viewer and scholar. It is not uncommon to find sentiments such as, seals represent the most abundant and continuous record of images from ancient West Asia, or, as it is still called in institutions including the Met, the ancient Near East, serving as a crucial source for its history, culture, and religion. Such statements place an enormous burden on these tiny objects. Tasked with such a weighty role in the construction of knowledge, I believe that in some ways, seals have had an outsized impact, and least of all vis-a-vis their size, on the larger discipline of the study of the cultures and peoples of ancient West Asia. For some time, I've been interested in how the development of this field of study has shaped the narratives around the people, places, and above all, objects from the past. I think my interest stems in large part because I work in a museum where objects are used as prompts to do something, frequently to tell a story. Recently, I've been thinking more about the role of cylinder seals, particularly in the formative stages of ancient Near Eastern studies, Assyriology, Oriental studies, just to list a few of the names given to the discipline over time. In the 19th century, the collecting, study, and publication of seals was an important conduit for the production of knowledge in this nascent field. Already by the turn of the 20th century, seals could provide an unparalleled view to the past, representing both the breadth of time and cultures that would come to characterize the history of ancient West Asian art, especially in contrast to other types of works of art or objects bearing images. How seals were studied and written about influenced the methodologies and approaches to the larger corpus of material culture, and by extension, standard historical studies of antiquity, which over time became fixed. There are, of course, many approaches to the study of cylinder seals, at times reflecting broader scholarly trends and often in dialogue with other avenues of research. A general concern with the identification of designs and carving styles and the establishment of a framework for categorizing these features, as well as an overall classification of the ever-expanding corpus of seals, has been a primary focus. Alongside this work, the iconographic interpretation of seal imagery, even in the absence of corresponding written sources, has been another persistent strategy, in a way relegating images to sources of cultural history. Today, I would like to consider how this interest in classification and interpretation is related to and really rooted in the collection, study, and probably display of cylinder seals in the 19th century, and in turn, how these concerns continue to resonate and shape how cylinder seals are employed to construct our understanding of the worlds in which they operated. My aim is to contextualize these central approaches to the study of cylinder seals by presenting some of my ongoing research on the topic, which has been focused primarily on the history of the Met's collection. I will end by looking at a group of cylinder seals as a prompt to the question, is it possible to consider how images on seals functioned as images within their own social and historical contexts? But first, I feel a real responsibility to spend part of this talk providing some introductory remarks of an explanatory and descriptive nature about cylinder seals. I'm fully aware that many of you here already know a great deal about this type of object. Others are likely to have varying degrees of familiarity, perhaps having viewed cylinder seals in museum displays and exhibitions, or seen photographs of them in a book or class. For those who do not have this prior knowledge or exposure, I hope that the following will not only provide some context for the rest of my talk, but also help illuminate why cylinder seals continue to both fascinate and confound. Seals were ubiquitous in ancient Mesopotamia, in use for millennia, and as I've already emphasized, provide us today with the most abundant and continuous record of images available for study. My focus here is on the cylinder seal, but it would be impossible to not mention stamp seals that appeared millennia before, often coexisted alongside, and survived long after the disappearance of cylinder seals, in some ways serving as a bridge to gems of the classical world. Cylinder seals were first used in Mesopotamia, the so-called heartland of ancient West Asia, located along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern Iraq and parts of Syria, Turkey, and Iran. They later spread to other regions, whereas stamp seals had a broader geographic range in all periods. To state the obvious, because seals were a part of the fabric of people's lives for millennia, it would be impossible to think that there is a one-size-fits-all approach to defining them. But I feel comfortable that highlighting this fact, that frankly is often elided, is fine for today. So I just want to emphasize that I am speaking in generalities in order to present an overview, but recognize that there existed much variability, both geographically and chronologically, in the many facets of cylinder seals that I will briefly touch on. And in this overview, I will be doing a bit of jumping around in both time and space. At the most basic, a cylinder seal is a small, often in the range of 3 centimeters high and 2 centimeters in diameter, cylindrical object whose curved sides are carved, incised, and or drilled with a range of complex patterns and designs which appear in relief when rolled across a malleable surface, usually clay. This rather straightforward description conceals the complexity inherent in these objects that presents a challenge in my mind when attempting to distill in a few words the multivalency of their objecthood. I'm choosing to begin this brief review with a focus on the word seal, which I recognize immediately privileges one facet of the object, its function, and really only one of its functions. The verb to seal means to secure the closure of something or to authorize or authenticate. These definitions are directly related to the two main categories of objects that cylinder seals were impressed on that survive today. In ancient Mesopotamia and the wider region, lumps of clay were pressed upon objects such as doors and storage containers in order to secure them, protecting their unauthorized opening and identify their owner. The exposed surfaces of the clay could then be impressed with a seal. Cylinder seals were also impressed on clay tablets and envelopes inscribed with cuneiform, the writing system developed in Mesopotamia and adopted by other languages over time. Rolling a cylinder seal across a document identified the responsible authority and served to denote the accuracy and authenticity of what was written on the document, a concept that eventually evolved into the legal concept of the signature as the only requirement for a legally binding agreement. Clay tablets could also be encased in clay envelopes that also were sealed, adding another layer of security. Documents inscribed with cuneiform and sealed with cylinder seals could be in other forms as well. At the site of Tel Meskineh, ancient Emar in Syria, the footprints of 2 children pressed into clay were excavated. The footprints were part of a contract for the sale of the children by their parents and were inscribed with their names. Witnesses who were present for the transaction rolled their cylinder seals on the clay footprints. And important to note in general is that it seems that it was the performative act of rolling a seal on a document that was an integral aspect of the seal's agency. While sealings, the term often used for clay lumps impressed with seals, was a strategy that was developed as early as the 6th millennium BCE in Greater Mesopotamia as a solution to the problem of monitoring and tracking of things. The invention of the cylinder seal coincided with the development of proto-writing in the middle of the 4th millennium BCE. From that point on, cylinder seals were intrinsically tied to cuneiform writing, and their use would spread to almost all communities that participated in the greater cuneiform culture across Western Asia. Their decline in popularity occurred in the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, when cuneiform and the clay tablets on which it was written was replaced by Aramaic inked on parchment, papyri, and leather. These documents were rolled and tied with a string whose knot was kept secure by stamping a stamp seal on wax or clay, thereby ensuring the stamp seals regained prominence and eventually replaced cylinder seals. But seals cannot only be defined by their function as tools in the administration of economic and judicial matters. Seals were also deeply personal and often protective objects that were fundamentally linked to identity and can be considered a primary extension of one's self. There are many ways one can explore this essential characteristic of seals, including through an administrative lens, where the impression a seal left was considered a marker of presence. In this way, seals combine an intimate relationship between owner and object with a more widely circulated and replicated image, which acts as a public marker of the physical presence of the private self. Another indication of the close relationship between a person and their seal is evidenced by their presence in burials, such as the well-known example from the burial of Puabi at Tel Mukhayar, ancient Ur in Iraq. Cylinder seals could also serve as votive offerings on behalf of a person. Inscriptions help identify these seals as votives, such as the example of the seal cutter, El Kanunid, on the seal on the slide, who presented it to a deity. Seals found in particular temple contexts also indicate this particular function. And even when a seal inscription does not indicate a votive function, the naming of a person on a seal was a powerful link to the identity, as naming in Mesopotamia held great significance. Cylinder seals, often perforated through the middle like a bead, could be suspended on a pin or other means so as to be worn on the body, providing another link between object and individual. In fact, the Sumerian word for wrist is kishabla, literally meaning seal carrier, place where the seal is hung. In fact, the Mesopotamian phenomenon of identity was deeply embedded in the organic body and the inorganic objects that were in contact with the body. From textual evidence, we know that in certain periods, seals were used as amulets and could have magical or protective powers, providing one explanation for why they were worn. They were also used in healing rituals and appear in omen literature, further reinforcing the bond between seal and identity. For example, I'll read just a few lines of what's on the screen. In his dream, one gives a seal, he will have a son. If in his dream one gives him a seal, he will have a son. If one gives him a seal of lapis lazuli, the gods. If one gives him a seal of red stone, he will have sons and daughters. If he wears a seal and one takes it away, either his son or daughter will die. If he wears a seal with his name and one takes it away, his son will die. Texts also note that for magical purposes, seals should be made of precious stones, and the varied materials that cylinder seals were made from provide yet another means for insight into their world. On the slide, you can read some of the associations between seal material and fate, but I'm referring to something more literal. An often cited example is lapis lazuli, which in antiquity was only sourced in the northeast region of modern Afghanistan, attesting to contact and trade as early as the 4th millennium BC. Seals were in fact made of many different kinds of material, including shell, bone, ivory, metals, glass, frit, and probably clay and wood that do not survive. However, the most common material was stone, including dark gray or green steatites, serpentines, limestone hematite, and different colors of calcites and jaspers. And clearly, color was of great importance. The production of cylinder seals has been the source of fascination, and while very little is actually known, seal cutters likely worked with files and drills in addition to chisels with different stones and styles of carving better suited to particular instruments. The craftsperson, using a carving technique in which the forms were cut below the surface of the material and in mirror image in order to create the raised impression and positive image. Aside from the difficulty in carving such a detailed image on a hard, small, and curved surface, imagine the challenge that faced the seal carver to create a design that would maintain its balance and clarity when rolled over and over again. Conceptually, this is very different from images that we are more commonly used to today, where the pictorial surface is limited by a frame, as in a painting. With the cylinder seal, the imagery can be repeated endlessly, and the pictorial field is only limited on the top and bottom by the size of the cylinder. Yet the entire pictorial field of the cylinder seal cannot be viewed until an impression is made. The duality of the images, those that appear on the object of the seal and those that appear in the impression, and the technology of replication are other aspects of the complexity of cylinder seals and the source of many theoretical interrogations. Finally, to turn to the imagery itself. There are many different themes represented on cylinder seals, and it is very difficult to discern what factors dictated the choice of certain imagery. In some periods, an endless variety is found, while in other periods there is little variation. There are geometric as well as figural designs, including, to name only a few, representations of economic activities, procession and banqueting scenes, combat or contest scenes, scenes with divine figures identified by horned headdresses, and the list could go on. But how to understand, interpret, or read the visualization of ideas, stories, and worldviews seemingly represented in the miniature images? This has been a major preoccupation. And although I will not be addressing today the concept of miniature, in which an object is a reduced copy of something larger, it is a topic that has resonance, especially in how the seal imagery may have related to contemporary large-scale images, which in many periods of ancient Mesopotamia is sparse. And I just want to note that Irene Winter considered scale and meaning in the iconography of Neo-Assyrian cylinder seals by comparing imagery on seals with imagery in sculpted reliefs in an article from 2000. She used as a springboard for her discussion the exhibition titled Bas-relief imaginaire, curated by Pierre Amier in 1973 at the Hôtel de la Monnaie in Paris, which featured enormous freestanding photographic blow-ups of the modern impressions, with the intended effect to showcase the sculptural richness of miniature seal carving by elevating it to the scale of monumental art. Ultimately, Winter observed that this illusion of scale disguises important variables of function, audience, and social context that have a bearing on the interpretation of images. I do think that uncoupling seal imagery from a possible large-scale source imagery could provide potential for utilizing miniaturization theory that explores the ways that small-scale or shrunken objects affect the people who interact with them. It was important for me to present this overview of cylinder seals for those of you in the audience unfamiliar with them, and don't think you are alone. In 1993, the Art Bulletin published Why Cylinder Seals? Engraved Cylindrical Seal Stones of the Ancient Near East, 4th to 1st millennium BC. In the article, Edith Parada, the preeminent scholar of cylinder seals in the 20th century, provided a basic introduction to the object type and a chronological survey of carving styles and motifs key to socio-political history. And I find it fascinating that this was published in the Art Bulletin, the leading academic journal for the study of art history. I will leave it at that. But I also want to add that I hope my overview would serve as a lens to the truly multivalent character of cylinder seals, which in turn allows for understanding how there can be and how there has been, in fact, so many varied approaches to seal studies. And I really wish I had time to tell you about all the innovative and thought-provoking scholarship, particularly in recent years. And I've had the privilege to see some of that work firsthand through the research conducted by fellows in the A&E department. But now I would like to switch gears and go back in time to examine the formative period of seal collecting and study by presenting some research I've been doing on the topic. The history of collecting seals and the history of seal studies are intrinsically related. The study of seals took place in the context of seal collections, which often influenced the manner of inquiry. Seals were familiar to collectors in the early modern period, related as a category to engraved gems through their small-scale materials and carving techniques. The materials used and imagery carved in them could also have aesthetic appeal, even if such imagery and often inscriptions, as well as the seal's forms, were not easily recognizable. Seals were the first artifacts from the cuneiform cultures of ancient West Asia to enter European collections, and studies of seal collecting and historiography have focused primarily on the European experience. Melissa Oppenheimer has written about the antiquarian-based collecting and publishing of seals in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, documenting their shift from anonymity to relative visibility, demonstrating that in early modern Europe, cylinder seals and stamp seals from West Asia were collected alongside and for a long time undifferentiated from classical and classicizing gems, while the imagery was interpreted through the lens of classical texts. A discernible shift occurred in the 19th century. Claudius James Rich, who worked as a representative of the East India Company in Baghdad from 1807 to 1821, is usually credited with being the first European to collect seals with the recognition of where they came from and their great antiquity. Seal studies shifted under Rich towards more objective observation, and he proposed that seals could have more than an amuletic function, the prevailing interpretation at the time, as he observed that the inscriptions were carved in reverse, so would have been used in impression. Rich acquired over 100 seals in and around Babylon, along with other artifacts he labeled Babylonian, and his widow Mary sold many of them to the British Museum in 1825. 2 decades later, the 1842 publication of A. Collamore's Oriental Cylinder Seals, Impressions of Ancient Oriental Cylinders or Rolling Seals of the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Medo-Persians, was the first catalog of seals, in this case, all cylinder seals, gathered from a number of collections with the intended purpose of quote, investigating the symbols and the extinct arrowhead literature of the Orientals, end quote. This was followed by Felix Layard's much more extensive study, which included 276 seals whose imagery was used to support interpretations on the worship of Mithras. The quantity of images available on the increasing number of seals signaled a shift away from seals collected and considered solely as beautiful objects. Seals were becoming tools in the research and study of the ancient past. Once the Syrian sites began to be uncovered and their large-scale sculptural works taken to Europe beginning in the 1840s, the corpus of ancient art available for study increased dramatically, as did the production of knowledge about ancient histories and culture. While reliefs from the Assyrian capitals of Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad became the focus of art historical attention and interpretation, seals continued to be collected by individuals and institutions primarily in Europe. Seal scholarship would soon adapt to the rapidly expanding knowledge base, particularly under the aegis of Joachim Menon. Trained in law and working as a magistrate in France, Menon was also deeply engaged in all things related to the cuneiform cultures known at the time. While he published widely on varied topics, it was his focus on seals that perhaps had the greatest impact on the scholarship at the time. Henri Frankfurt, who subsequently had a great impact on seal studies in the 20th century, referred to him as, quote, that pioneer in our field, pointing to Menon's approach of connecting seals with historical eras. His 2 volumes, La Pierre Gravée de la Haute Asie, was the first attempt to establish a basic chronological sequence, utilizing the inscriptions on cylinder seals as well as seal tablets. Menon wrote frequently on seals, including catalogs of important collections formed by individuals. He was also the first seal scholar to publish a study of seals in an American collection. In an article in the American Journal of Archaeology and the History of Fine Arts from 1886, Menon described and illustrated 16 of the cylinder seals and 2 stamp seals from the collection of Robert Stanton Williams of Utica, New York, which had been begun by his brother, Reverend William Frederick Williams, a missionary who had worked in Beirut, Mosul, and Mardin. And while this seal collection has dispersed today, I did find one example of one of the seals for sale at Sotheby's in 2019. Drawing on his previous seal studies as the foundation for assigning each seal to a chronological and geographic location, he in turn used the Williams seals to show the, quote, general characteristics of the art of gem cutting in Western Asia and the differences which characterize it according to period and locality, end quote. Menon introduced the idea of different schools of seal cutting based on style and subject matter and provided 2 overarching categories, Chaldean and Assyrian. He also attempted to understand imagery, providing possible interpretations based on the latest scholarship, in particular George Smith's The Chaldean Account of Genesis. Throughout the article, Menon referenced other seal collections providing comparanda for imagery. His systematic review of each seal with a focus on classification and interpretation exemplified an approach which was foundational to the study of seals. The importance of his work on seals was recognized in a review of the book by Arthur Frothingham, Jr., in the same journal, describing it as, quote, a work of capital importance for archaeology in general and invaluable for the study of Babylonian antiquities, end quote, thereby situating the importance of glyptic art in the larger field of study of the day. Frothingham, who had a background in Semitic languages and theology, was a professor at Princeton University in one of the first art history departments in the United States and taught the first graduate art history course at Princeton titled Babylonian Archaeology. Overall, his 8-page review is a useful summary of what was known about ancient West Asian seals at the time, as well as the thoughtful assessment of Menon's approach to seal studies. 10 years later, Frothingham would reiterate the importance of seals for the study of art history in a textbook of the history of sculpture. And seals were identified as a valuable source, in fact, for the study of Babylonian sculpture. In listing the most important collections, the Metropolitan Museum in New York was named alongside 4 others, all the rest located in Europe. By the time of the book's publication in 1896, less than 30 years after its founding, the Met housed the first substantial collection of seals from ancient West Asia in the United States, numbering over 1,000. Here, the collecting of seals, both cylinders and stamps, was recognized by the museum as an important endeavor that would help build the reputation of the young institution. The collection was formed through varied acquisitions and was able to represent a more complete picture of ancient West Asia than might have been the case if such a consideration was limited to other categories of art. In the United States, the acquisition of seals was recognized as a strategy for building collections of ancient West Asian antiquities, an area where collecting was dominated by Europeans with colonial interests that facilitated the extraction of objects from Ottoman lands. Cylinder and stamp seals were among the earliest acquisitions of ancient art at the Met, as they were represented in the enormous collection of objects purchased from Luigi Palma di Cesnola, as well as part of the King collection gifted to the Met by its president, John Taylor Johnston, in 1881. While the Cesnola and King Johnson acquisitions formed the foundation of the Met's collection of ancient West Asian seals, they were limited in scope and not collected primarily as representative of Assyrian and Babylonian antiquities. This would change in 1886 when the Met purchased several hundred objects from the Reverend William Hayes Ward, who had brought them back from his travels on the Wolf expedition to Babylonia in 1884-85, and included stamp and cylinder seals. The cylinder seals were highlighted in a lengthy description in the acquisition in the annual report of 1886, identifying, quote, upwards of 260 cylinders which date from the earliest Chaldean periods down to that of the Assyrian monarchy, adding to, quote, the valuable series of cylinders already in the museum, bringing the whole collection up to such numbers and value that it ranks as the second museum collection in the world, that in the British Museum being first, end quote. By identifying its own seal collection as the second best in the world, the Met was showcasing its ability to compete in the collection building of the time, something that was not possible with, say, Assyrian sculpture. The seal collection continued to grow, and in 1895, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Handbook Number 12, Seal Cylinders and Other Oriental Seals, included 751 cylinder seals and 268 stamp seals. Ward, who was the author, stated that the majority of the seals were gathered by him during the Wolf expedition or by correspondence with parties in the East since then. The publication of a handbook devoted solely to seals from ancient West Asia is yet another indication that the Met held this material in high esteem. The handbook was essentially a catalog, and although not every seal is described, Ward's overall approach is clear when he wrote that seals were classified according to nationality and the mythological designs engraved on them. The catalog included the seal's material and brief descriptions of the design. Unfortunately, there were no illustrations, although this was standard practice for the museum's handbooks. The overall approach to presenting the seals is reminiscent of Menon's, with an emphasis on classification and interpretation of the imagery. The significance of studying seals was explicitly related to their value in providing knowledge about the past, as Ward indicates when he wrote, quote, the main labor in the study of cylinders has to be given to their mythological meaning. They supply an invaluable source of information as to the earliest religious ideas and history of the human race and along the most important lines of the descent of civilization, end quote. One of the functions of the museum's handbooks was to provide the visitor with information about the objects on display, one reason why they generally did not include illustrations. Ward wrote about the location of the Met seals, as well as how they were displayed. Quote, they occupy 4 cases on the west side of the gold room in the north wing, and a 5th is filled with other sorts of seals. The study of these cylinders is made possible by the impressions on the gutta percha, which accompany them and which are gilded to afford by the reflection of a better distinction of light and shade, end quote. It's apparent from the description that the cylinder and stamp seals were in different cases, and archival documentation shows the order of the handbook followed that of the display. 2 labels exist in the Met's archives that may date to this time period. They refer to 2 of the inscribed cylinder seals from the Cesnola collection, and each gives the material and date of the seal, along with the translation of the cuneiform inscription. And I love the description of over 4,500 years old, exclamation point. The Met seems to have been a locus for teaching about seals from ancient West Asia. An 1886 advertisement read, quote, faithful and correct reproductions, casts, or impressions of Babylonian and Assyrian seal cylinders and tablets for colleges and other scientific institutions or private collections may be obtained by application to Charles Balliard. Balliard was the museum's first restorer and photographer, and presumably he was using the seals in the Met's collection for his advertised work. Similarly, in 1893, Ward gave 4 lectures at the Met on the subject of Oriental seals and glyptic art with titles such as Origin in Primitive Babylonia, Mythological Art of the Early and Middle Empire of Babylonia. These were part of a series of public lectures on varied topics arranged by Columbia College and the museum that took place on Saturdays at 11 a.m. from 1891 to 1900. The display, publication, and perhaps teaching of seals at the Met reflected the broader cultures of art beyond Assyria and Babylonia. The seals in its collection also participated in the larger work of classification that was taking place in the scholarship at the time, and that would remain a focus of seal studies for a very long time. In the 20th century, seals found in secure contexts on archaeological excavations would anchor such work. Interestingly, this potential was already recognized by Frothingham in his review of Menon's work discussed before. When referring to the seals that would eventually be acquired by the Met through Ward, he wrote, "The largest collection and one of the finest in existence is, however, that brought home nearly a year ago by Dr. William Hayes Ward, who made it during the Wolf expedition to Babylonia, conducted under the auspices of the Archaeological Institute. The collection, amounting to about 250 Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Syrian, Hittite, and Phoenician cylinders, includes many choice examples, and many which possess the peculiar value that the localities from which they came are known. As I shall have occasion to remark on the impossibility which M. Menon has found, with few exceptions of, attributing any group of cylinders with certainty to any particular school and city, the importance of this certified provenance will easily be seen," end quote. This potential was not realized, and in fact, almost all of the cylinder seals in the Met's collection were sold in 1908 to J.P. Morgan, the Met's president at the time, and absorbed into the collection at his library. And that would be a subject of a whole other lecture. The Met's role in the development of 19th century attitudes towards collecting ancient seals from Western Asia and their study is not commonly recognized. I believe its early seal collection, in fact, formed a core body of material utilized for the study, display, and teaching of the cultures and art of ancient West Asia in the United States, and through the work of Ward would have larger ramifications. Along with Menon, whose system of seal classification was foundational to the field, Ward's approach of the interpretation of seal imagery still resonates. Attempting to understand this imagery, especially through connections with texts, both cuneiform and biblical, and at times the two together, was a prime focus of the work. Ward wrote many articles on seal imagery with titles like The Serpent Tempter in Oriental Mythology, Tiamat and Other Evil Spirits as Figured on Oriental Seals, The Goddesses in Primitive Babylonian Art. And the culmination of his life work, Seal Cylinders of Western Asia, in 1910, was organized into 71 chapters, the majority of which were based on iconography and included drawings of over 1,300 seals. This volume is still sometimes cited as a reference in recent scholarship, despite having been written over 100 years ago, and reflecting an outdated understanding of much that was presented. Ward appears to recognize the potential for gaps of knowledge when he wrote, quote, "I have especially desired to study the forms under which the gods and their emblems were worshipped, so that we may add pictorial representations to the literary material which a host of scholars have gathered. While I have given my best efforts to make this work as nearly complete as possible, yet I know there will be many points brought out which will give further suggestion to learned Assyriologists who will find from the text light which has escaped me." And this leads me to the final part of my talk today. I want to end with a brief consideration of a group of cylinder seals whose imagery has been a source of much interest and interpretation, going back to the early days of the field, which I just discussed. These are the so-called Etana seals, who share an easily recognizable and distinctive scene made up of particular pictorial elements. About 20 or so cylinder seals are identified as belonging to the Etana group, all dating to the Akkadian period in the 3rd millennium BCE, a time that witnessed great political changes in Mesopotamia. Akkadian seal imagery in general has been celebrated for its particularly rich repertory of motifs and innovative iconography. The Etana cylinder seals, with their seemingly narrative quality, fit precisely into this framework, and their imagery has been the subject of much discussion by a range of scholars, including art historians, archaeologists, and Assyriologists. The name of the group is derived from an association with the legendary first king of Kish, Etana, who is known from literary sources from the 2nd and 1st millennium BCE. The Etana legend, or myth of Etana, is a story about the king's quest to get hold of the plant of birth so that he might have a son. In the story, Etana ascends to heaven on an eagle in search of the plant, and it is this episode that is linked to one of the elements of the seal imagery, the depiction of a man flying on the back of an eagle, creating the impression of a visual rendering of the story. The other pictorial elements on this group of seals vary, although the depiction of dogs looking up at the eagle on whose back sits a human being and a herd of animals also appear frequently. And I think you can see from the selection of seals on the screen just how detailed this imagery is. In part because the imagery is actually quite varied across the seal group, there have been a number of differing interpretations, including ones that do not believe that there is any link between the imagery and the story, as there are no texts that date to the Akkadian period. And I could not resist including the following quotation from the text. "When he had borne him aloft 1 league, look, my friend, how the land is now. The land circumference is become 1/5 of its size. The vast sea is become like a paddock. When he had borne him aloft a 2nd league, look, my friends, how the land is now. The land has become a garden plot, and the vast sea has become a trough." And talk about miniature worlds. But my point in bringing up the Etana group of cylinder seals is not to discuss these varied interpretations or even to disparage the approach. Rather, it is to highlight how persistent this line of inquiry is and desire to relate seal imagery to the written word, a text. Although already in 1886, Ward was looking for a literary source for the imagery when he published 2 of the seals, and by 1894, E.T. Harper had made a link between a recently translated text of the Etana legend and these seals, so that by 1910, Ward could devote a whole chapter to the subject. And jumping to 2013, an article published in the Journal of the American Oriental Society with the title, quote, "Etana in Eden, New Light on the Mesopotamian and Biblical Tales in Their Semitic Context," proposed a link between the Mesopotamian Etana legend and Genesis's Garden of Eden story. It also included an illustration of an Etana seal, which seems almost like a reflex at this point. Something that is not commonly discussed with the Etana seal group is that there are actually a few examples of clay ceilings with the Etana imagery, evidence that these seals were used most likely in an administrative context. And it is the existence of these clay ceilings that prompted me to think about the question I posed at the start of my talk. Is it possible to consider how images on seals functioned as images within their own social and historical context, rather than illustrations or secondary sources of information? I have, in fact, been interested for a long time in seals and sealings from the Akkadian period. And I was going to read the title of my dissertation, but Kim already did that at the start. So I will just say, in that study, I focused on the development and use of contest scene imagery on Akkadian period seals through the study of sealing practices, considering the intersection of imagery, inscription, and sealing. I grounded my analysis on the actual function of the seals by examining sealing practices and concluded that changes in the visual expression of this particular subject were a response to the nature of sealing practice, which itself underwent transformation during the Akkadian period. Granted, it was a long time ago, but I think I was interested in this topic in part because sealings impressed with Akkadian seals were not really ever considered in the vast scholarship on Akkadian cylinder seals. It is true that the inscribed seals on sealings were used as early as Menon to reconstruct history, but the sealings were overshadowed by the far greater number of actual cylinder seals and their undeniable allure and appeal. Because of my more recent historiographic research, I now see that this is in part a result of collecting practices in the 19th and early 20th century. Akkadian seals were highly prized and ripe for exactly the kinds of interpretation strategies developed for other kinds of art, in particular from the classical world. In any case, I returned to my dissertation in preparing this talk because I wanted to take a look at the imagery found on ceilings from this time period. And for that study, I had actually documented all imagery, not just those with the contest scene. I was particularly struck by ceilings impressed with seals with images of gods. And this is not surprising, since the explosion of images, especially those depicting the divine and supernatural creatures, is a hallmark of Akkadian cylinder seals. But what does it mean to create an image of a god when a seal is impressed on clay? Clay's importance in the conceptual and mythological world of ancient Mesopotamia as the basic material from which life was created is well known. my colleague Sarah Graff has explored the relationship between this metaphysical aspect of the material of clay and image making in the context of mold-made plaques, where she argues that pressing clay in a mold could be understood as analogous to the act of creation, as described in the mythological epic of Atrahasis. And Sarah and I have had many fruitful conversations that I thank her for on what it would entail to build on this thinking, to consider the relationship between clay and the images carved on seals, which are made visible, in some ways created when a seal is rolled or impressed on clay. And with the cylinder seal, the imagery is only visible in its entirety once it's rolled out. Are the images activated in some way through the matrix of the clay? Do they gain agency through the material of the clay? These images emerge from clay, a charged material endowed with the potential for life. Is there in some ways a mirroring of the experience of the gods creating humans from clay? Can this idea also be extended to inscriptions on seals? It's commonly observed that the inscriptions are carved in reverse on the seal so as to appear legible in the impression, to be read more easily in the clay. The clay gives voice to the signs, and once again, as they emerge from the clay, they are being both written and perhaps spoken. And to go back to the actual cylinder seals, what might it mean to hold an image of a god in your hand? A fundamental aspect of the Mesopotamian conception of the cosmos is that destiny is never entirely in human hands, and the course of human narratives resides ultimately in the hands of the gods. Are the tables turned here? Further, what might it mean to touch an image of the god? Here I could really see the benefit of exploring miniaturization theory and the ways that small-scale objects affect the people who interact with them. The study of cylinder seals is as varied as the many facets of the objects themselves. I understand why classification and iconographic interpretation have taken such a prominent position, and again want to emphasize the value and importance of that work. I think these methodologies follow well-established paradigms. I also understand how an approach to sealing practices holds appeal. The administrative world of seals is something we can comprehend. It's relatable to us today as systems that are familiar, but it's the world of images that's more of a challenge. And in the end, I've come to embrace and, dare I say, admire what is, to my mind, the cylinder seals resistant to our incessant need in the modern world to capture, to replicate, to take everything as ours. And I really see this in the almost impossibility of the display and imaging of cylinder seals, which are things close to my heart as someone who works in a museum with aims of doing just this. And I just end with this idea of how we use today things like 3D images and modeling of seals and their relationship to the worlds of the past. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Now it's working. Thank you very much for being with us this wonderful Friday afternoon. I am Martina Ruggiari, Associate Curator in the Islamic Art Department here at the Met, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker to the Wilkinson Lecture Series today, Walls in Miniature, Avinoam Shalem. Avinoam Shalem is the Riggio Professor of the History of the Arts of Islam at Columbia University. He received his PhD at the University of Edinburgh and is the author and editor of more than 13 books and really innumerable articles. He initiated and co-curated exhibitions and still runs major international research projects. Prior to coming to Columbia as the Riggio Professor, he held the professorship of the History of the Arts of Islam at the University of Munich in 2002 to 2013. And amongst his innumerable appointments, which are really too long to even list here, I want to remember that he was an Andrew Mellor Senior Fellow here at the Met in 2006. And he was also, among the other positions, the Max Planck Professor Fellow at the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence between 2007 and 2015, scholar in residence at the Getty Research Center twice in 2009 and 2019. He's currently running the research project Black Mediterranean, Mediterraneo Nero, Artistic Encounters and Counter-Narratives, Incontri artistici e contronarrazioni, as part of the Getty Foundation's Connecting Art Histories initiatives, together with Alina Payne at the Villa I Tatti, the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. Professor Shalem, I can say, is one of the most distinguished scholars in the discipline of Islamic art. But his work is relevant well beyond the traditional boundaries of our field. His research encompasses the global context of the visual cultures in the Mediterranean, the Near East, North Africa, Spain, South Italy, and Sicily. And if the medieval and early modern periods of Professor Shalem's perhaps main focus or original focus, he also reaches out to the contemporary implications, modern and contemporary implications of our work as art historians, with a specific interest in the image of so-called Islamic art and the historiography of the field. And I want to give you just an example of his many, many publications to show you the breadth of his work. Among his many books, I will mention Islam Christianized, Islamic Portable Objects in the Medieval Church Treasuries of the Latin West, 1996 and 1998, and more recently, he co-edited Seeking Transparencies, Rock Crystals Across the Medieval Mediterranean, published in 2020. And I'll just have to list a couple of these articles, including, for example, made it for the show, The Medieval Treasuries of the Kaaba in Mecca, in the Iconography of Islamic Art, the festschrift in honor of Professor Robert Hillenbrand, edited by Bernard O'Kane and published in 2004. Or also a very important article, Dangerous Claims on the Othering of Islamic Art History and How it Operates Within Global Art Histories, in Kritische Berichte, Zeitschrift für Kunst und Kulturwissenschaft in 2012. Hitler's Carpet, A Tale of One City, in Mitteilungen des Kunsthistorisches Institutes in Florence, 2013. And something that may be relevant to us, the Transformative Museum. Why do we need another museum for the arts of Islam? In the recently edited book by Manuel Aloa and Chiara Cappelletto, published in 2020, Dynamics of the Image, Moving Images in the Global World. Today, for the Charles Wilkinson Lecture Series on Walls in Miniature, Professor Shalem will talk about monumentalizing the past, remembering violence, the 1535 conquest of Tunis carved on a rock crystal. Please join me in welcoming Professor Shalem to the podium.
Well, good afternoon to all of you here in the room here, and those on Zoom. I would like also, of course, to thank Martina, my colleague and friend, for the kind words of introduction. And though I do not belong to this monumental world called the Metropolitan Museum, I know exactly how much work has been put in order to put this nice afternoon here at the Metropolitan, and I would like to thank all the people involved, and especially Navina from the Islamic department, who was the one who invited me to join here. I think that it's also a token of the connectivity that both institutions, the academia, the university, and the museum are in need of. That means the transfer or the sharing of knowledge. So let me start. I'm going to take you for, how was it, 4,500 before the Common Era to the 16th century of the Common Era. Just have to change glasses. In his famous book, Treatise on Calligraphers and Painters, a compilation of histories on the lives and education of calligraphers and painters from Iran in the 16th century, Qadi Ahmad ibn Mirmunshi al-Husseini, a native of the city of Qum, provided us with this specific anecdote, and let me cite it. Another famous master of calligraphy was Omar Akhtar. He had no right hand, hence his surname Akhtar, namely the one whose hand was cut off, and with his left filled the pages in such manner that the eyes of experts were filled with wonder, and the reason of sages was troubled by the contemplation of them. For the Lord of Time, Amir Timur Gurkhan, namely Tamerlane, he wrote a copy of the Quran in a specific writing. It was so small in volume that it could be fitted under the socket of a signet ring. He presented it to the Lord of the Time, but as he had written the divine word in such microscopic characters, Timur did not approve of it or accepted it and did not deign to favor him. Omar Akhtar wrote another copy, extremely large, each of its lines being cubits in length and even longer. Having finished, decorated, and bound the manuscript, he tied it on a barrow and took it to the palace of the Lord of the Time. Hearing that the Sultan came out to meet him, accompanied by all the clergy, dignitaries, emirs, and pillars of the state, and rewarded the calligrapher with great honor, marks of respect, and endless favor. And Qadi Ahmad ended his narration by saying, one folio of this copy was in the possession of Muwallana Malik. And I would like to add that another of these folio might be at the Met today, as Sheila Canby tells us too. And there is even another one in Qatar, in Doha. What can we learn from this anecdote, beside the obvious juxtaposition that we all love, namely of exhibiting the big vis-a-vis the small, and apart from the usual discussion about the macro and the micro, or one can even generally speak about the lure of the setting of two oppositions next to each other, as if presenting to Timur two rivals, namely the production of a monumental and the minuscule Quran script, the riddle remains. Why did Timur clearly rejected the signet rings Quran of Omar Akhtar? Timur was not interested at all in this type of artistic bravura. His interest lies in the production of the oversized object, the one that suppresses human body's proportion, the one that merges into the realm of the unnatural, almost the abnormal, which in turn seemingly does not abide to any human proportions and laws. Yet Timur is interested in the gigantic as related to the idea of the megalomaniac, namely there, perhaps unnaturally and metaphorically speaking, the wish to power and control. Moreover, as far as Timur is concerned, the absurdity embedded in the miniature object, namely the possibility to store a whole Quran in a bezel of a signet ring, is out of question, nor the fascinating relationship between the tiny and the big, namely the calculated and measured process of miniaturization, a scientific system involving the systematic, proportion-based, and mathematically calculated reduction in size. Yet the ability of us to lose our sense of reality and move into the realm of almost fantasy while observing the miniature object, because the simple, obvious relativism between the large and the small in this world is suddenly distorted, is less attractive to Timur as a beholder. For him, simply said, size matters. The minuscule is reduced by Timur to the insignificant, up to the point that the tiny Quran of Omar Akhtar can be simply ignored and rejected. Thus, the tiny, almost microscopic Quran turned to be invisible, to the point that it can be simply disregarded. I would like to turn today our attention. I'm sorry, the image is not that good. I think I will take the other one, though I wanted to start with this one. I would like to turn our attention today to a rather small object. I would like to focus on a mid-16th century carved cameo of rock crystal, which is kept at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Unfortunately, the biography of this rock crystal cannot trace back that far, and we lack much information as to its full itinerary in Europe after its completion, probably in Faenza, around 1544. Yet, its first record is dated 1906, in which it is reported to have been sold with the help of Jacques Seligman to the Pierpont Morgan. Seligman was a successful German antiquarian and art dealer who works mainly in Paris, but opened an office in New York in 1904. In 1917, it was given as a gift by Pierpont Morgan to the Metropolitan Museum. It is a relatively large elliptical piece of a fine and transparent rock crystal. The object height measures 4¼ inch, namely almost 11 centimeters, and its width measures 4½ inch, namely 11½ centimeter. So something about this size. It is framed by an enamel oval frame, which was made later, most probably in the 19th century. According to the restorer report, this enamel and gold frame was made in mid-19th century, and I would like to thank Wolfram Köppe, senior curator at the European Sculpture Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum, for providing me with the access to the file on this object. The piece is signed at the very bottom by its maker, and you can see it here, in this area here. And the name is Giovanni Bernardi da Castelbolognese. The signature, and I have here, sorry, to go back. And the signature is made by putting his name, Johannes, at the beginning here. I cannot see with these glasses now. And then B for Bernardus, and then here by the end, F for Fetsit. Bernardi was born in Castel Bolognese in 1496 and died in Faenza in 1553. Some information about his vita is gathered by several historians of the day. According to Giorgio Vasari, he was a skillful engraver of gamestones and a medalist, the son of the goldsmiths Bernardo Bernardi and the brother of Orfeo Bernardi, who also worked at the family-run bodega. Giovanni gained his education as an intaglio carver, mainly during 3 years of working at the court of Alfonso d'Este in Ferrara. According to the notable men and women of our time, the Vitae Virorum Illustrium of the physician and man of letters Paolo Giovio, Bernardi arrived in Rome around 1530 at Giovio's advice. Bernardi was immediately hired by the Cardinals Giovanni Salviati and Ippolito de' Medici. Moreover, he was given the task to make a medallion with the portrait of Pope Clement VII, which gave him a full access to the Vatican Circle. And in fact, as Benvenuto Cellini attests in his autobiography, in his first book, in chapter 65, and I cite here, asserisce che per essere venuto a Roma un certo Giovanni da Castelbolognese, molto valentuomo per far medagli di quelle sorte che io facevo in acciaio e che non desideravo altro al mondo che di fare a gara con questo valentuomo. And I explain, it is asserted that a certain Giovanni from Castel Bolognese has arrived in Rome, a very skilled man for making medals of the kind that I used to make in steel and that I wanted nothing else in the world than to compete with this good man. Bernardi was a prolific artisan. There are at least 44 records of engraved rock crystal which are either signed or assigned to Bernardini, and many of them were produced later while using molds, reproducing them in other materials like bronze and even in gold. In 1539, after spending full 9 productive years in Rome, Bernardi moved to Faenza, still keeping on working for varied commissions made by the Pope and the Farnese family. The carved oval piece that is in focus today was made in Faenza too, most probably around 1544. This is assumed because this specific object is mentioned in a letter sent on April 21, 1544 to Bernardi to Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. It was designed for a specific cassetta or cofanetto, namely a casket, the so-called cofanetto farnesiano, which is kept today in the Museo Nazionale di Capodimonte in Napoli. The oval rock crystal has an overall slightly curved surface with vaguely sloped beveled edges. It depicts the conquest of Tunis by Charles V in 1535. The depiction, I'm moving here because you see it much better on this background. The depiction is divided into 2 main zones. On the left side, strongly recalling a typical cartographic image, is an oblique view of the Bay of Tunis. There is a kind of a, this might be better. Its famous circular lagoon and the fortified complex of La Goulette. The well-protected walled city of Tunis is depicted at the very upper left side, a large tower encircled by well-defended walls, most probably referring to La Goulette, is set on the shore just in front of the main gate to the city. Another large walled complex, which attached to the city wall just next to the right side, probably refers to the walled area of the safeguarded palace. The sea is packed. Large warships with their flattering sails have just released their fighting soldiers into small boats, and the many soldiers are energetically rowing towards the shore of Tunis. On the right side, we see an extremely dense and dramatic, almost chaotic battle scene with its central image, a well-equipped Roman warrior who defeats with his right leg a naked, rather strong barbarian. So I'm looking at this image here. And here's the leg pressing here on this person who is falling naked in this area. This central figure clearly stands out as the main and important figure in this melodramatic scene, referring to the victorious Charles V during the capture of Tunis. The carving is exquisite, and the clear and transparent quality of the oval rock crystal enhance the beholder's amazement and admiration in front of this object. It is as if a transparency of the crystal, a limpid water-like one, helps and encourages our eyes to see better, forcing us to focus and concentrate while looking at this carved scene. For a moment, it seems as if we look at this miniature and its detailed mise-en-scène through a magnifying glass. And indeed, we do look through glass because the whole image is carved on the glass-like surface of the translucent mineral of crystal. For a moment, it also appears as if we look through water. Thus, the whole battle scene starts to clutter and shake. The naval warship drift on the wavy water of La Goulette. The soldier fervently rowing boats seems to speedily propel the vessels toward the city gate of Tunis. At the same time, on the other side of this medallion, on the field battle, another drama takes place. Here, the scene of the dynamic, enhanced by the impression of seeing through water, the clash between the army of Charles V and the Muslim warriors of Tunis is animated. It appears as if the image of this combatant and their horses started to move, and one can imagine the sounds of war and banging of metals and flesh. Moreover, and as far as materiality is concerned, the pellucidity of rock crystal present to us the images as if transparent, as if lacking the concreteness of their corporality, as if they lost weight. The opaqueness, which is so characteristic to any painting or any solid materials, is replaced by extreme clarity. This pellucidity endows the ethereal feel to this historic scene. As we look at this spectral vision, as if we envision some ghosts of the past, but at the same time, it suggests as if we look at the spirit, hence the essence of this battle of 1535. As mentioned above, the plaque belongs to a series of another 6 carved rock crystal medallions, which were all made by Giovanni Bernardi for decorating the silver and lapis lazuli wall of the Farnese casket, commissioned by Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, and all produced most probably between 1548 to 1561. The series depicts ancient mythical battles, such as and I'm going to show 2 by 2. I'll start with the left, and I go to the right. So on the left, Corsa della Quadriga, the race of the 4 horses chariot, then the Naumachia, the naval battle, then we have the Amazonomachia, the Amazon battle, and then we have the Centauromachia on the other side. And the last 2, we are looking at the Caccia de Meleagro, the hunt of the wild boar, and the Trifono di Bacco, the triumph of Bacchus. The conquest of Tunis of 1535, sorry again, this too wide, it appears too wide, this slide here. The conquest of Tunis of 1535, originally designed to be set within these mythical iconographies of the classical past, stand out as different because it is anchored in the historical event of 1535. Yet within this context, it suggests a Rinascimento, a classicizing act of setting the battle of heroic classical times. For some reason which are not yet clear, this plaque was not integrated into the decorative program of this casket. It has been suggested that the historically accuracy by which the topography of the site of Tunis Bay was rendered probably does not fit to the other scene, all of which accentuate heroism and bravery regardless specificities of site or time. The plaque's reference to the specific event anchored in our historical time might well be contributing to its uniqueness and less aesthetic suitability to the other 6 carved pieces. Indeed, the topographical depiction of Tunis and its famous La Goulette were most probably copied by Bernardi from prints which were circulating in Europe in the 16th century. And I show here, for example, some drawings that are dated to this moment, which, as you see here, the Agostino Veneziano, based on Agostino Veneziano, and another one which is a bit later and come from the famous Brown and Hogenberg book on the world. Now, both of these prints that we see here are both actually drawing their information from 2 artists who joined Charles V on his expedition to Tunis at that year, namely the Dutch artist Jan Cornelis Vermeyen and Herman Postumus. The fight over the waters of the Mediterranean Sea was and still is a struggle for hegemony and control of movement and trade. Thus, the straits and crucial sea passages of the Mediterranean were always the target zone from which empires could exercise their political power and hegemony over sea and land. And I refer here to the famous spaces like the Strait of Gibraltar, Messina, the Bosphorus, and in our modern era, of course, the Suez Canal, or as we witness in the recent crisis between Russia and Ukraine, if we take, of course, the Black Sea as extension of the Mediterranean, it is the Sea of Azov. Strategic port cities, straits, and crucial sea passages of the Mediterranean Sea were and still are target zone, or slightly, mildly formulated spaces of desire, from which empires exercise their political power and exert hegemony over sea and land. Situated at the very heart of the Mediterranean and controlling the movement between the 2 Mediterranean seas, the Western and the Eastern seas, as well as commanding the Saharan trade routes from Africa to Italy, Tunis appears as one of the important sites within the fluid landscape of imperial desire, and as a port city, part of the sought-after aquatic space of naval hegemonies. At the age of Suleiman the Magnificent, during his long reign from 1520 to 1566, and within the arrival of the Ottomans in Tunisia, namely the landing of the Grand Admiral Khaireddin Barbarossa on August 15, 1534, on the shores of Bizeret, a radical change in the imperial sea hegemony of the Mediterranean occurred. Though earlier European powers might have claimed great success in expanding into the new world of the Americas and in controlling the sea routes along the coast of Africa and India, the old world was under the fear of the growing power of the Ottomans and their rapid expansions. The annexation of Syria into the Ottoman Empire in 1516 assured Ottoman control of the East Mediterranean port city, especially those engaged in large web trade of the Silk Road and of the fragrant substances of the Arabian Peninsula. The fall of Egypt into the hands of the Ottomans in 1517 consolidated the Ottomans' control of the old trade routes from the Mediterranean via the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Thus, the victorious entry of Khayr-ed-Din Barbarossa to Tunis in August 1534, and the apparent Ottoman wish to expand their power along the shores of the Mediterranean came as no surprise. These expansions destabilized the whole aquatic trading space of the Old World, namely the Mediterranean. On June the 1st, and that's what you see here, in 1535, armed by the robust naval power, Charles V attacked La Goulette. He left Barcelona with his armada and directly was one line from Barcelona, if you just think, did the cut directly to Tunis. Charles V attacked La Goulette and entered the city of Tunis. The occupation of Tunis by the Habsburg lasted almost 40 years, namely until Tunis was recaptured by the Ottomans in 1574. It is true that the Habsburg were not ruling Tunis directly, as usually carried out by great empires, namely new conquered lands were given to local governors who were allowed to maintain a restricted power under the vigilant eye of the new ruling potence. Charles V did the same. His vassals were members of the Hafsid dynasties, a Sunni Berber dynasty which was set to power already in 1229 in this region, namely in Ifriqiya, by the Almohads at the time. Yet, beyond the Christian-Muslim politics of the day, the fall of Tunis at the hands of the powerful ruler of the Habsburg, Charles V, mark a turning point in the histories of East-West interaction, the interactions with Tunisia's classical past, such as the archaeological ruins of the city of Carthage, initiated a novel scientific and historical gaze for studying this space. This antiquarian approach of the 16th century went beyond the common Orientalist vision, recalling to some extent the later Napoleon Bonaparte discovery of the ancient ruins of Egypt by the end of the 18th century. Moreover, a sharper perception was born for writing history in general and of the Mediterranean history in particular, which helped Europe to define its classical past and to renew its identity as the fresh old world. Yet today, I would like to focus on the records of the Battle of Tunis while focusing on some details depicted in this rock crystal of Bernardi. Interesting as it might be to find the classical origin of this battle composition, and tempting as it is to connect the concept of the Rinascimento of the 16th century to the propaganda program of Charles V, namely associating his victory in Tunis with dramatic historical moments of the classical period, and especially with the Punic War in Carthage, my aim is to call our attention to the setting of Charles V in this carved piece as a valiant Roman emperor fighting barbarians. As suggested by Dacos in 1995, the composition for this battle might be inspired by one of the scenes, the capture of La Goulette, which formed part of a series of paintings on the African expeditions decorating on a triumphal arch, which was erected in 1535, a temporary architectural structure, right after the triumph of Tunis in Rome, next to the church of San Marco, for celebrating Charles V's arrival in Italy. The specific painting of the Triumph of Africa, which made by Francesco Salviati, drew upon a composition made earlier in Tunis by the Dutch artist Posthumus. Unfortunately, the painting did not survive, but a preparatory drawing for this completion of this painting was made by Salviati, which we see here, which is kept today at the École des Beaux-Arts. The drawing clearly suggests that Bernardi was somehow exposed to this painting of Salviati, or even to one of the copies. Propagandic images of the capture of Tunis by Charles V are numerous and are varied. They appear on large monumental embroideries, small medallions, woodcuts, processional shields, and even feather-embroidered shields from Mexico. Bernardi was most probably fascinated by Charles V. For example, on February 14, 1530, on the occasion of Charles V's coronation in the church of San Petronio in Bologna, Bernardi prepared a portrait of his on a golden medal. The object was admired, and an invitation to join the royal court in Madrid came immediately after the presentation of this medal. Bernardi politely turned down this offer. Yet, he was later involved in making the portraits of Margherita d'Austria, the daughter of Emperor Charles V. One cannot avoid contemplating on the brutal and violent image of Charles V on his horse, crashing with his foot naked barbarian. Charles V is fully equipped as a fighting Roman commander-in-chief, wearing a metal helm on his head, dressed with a coat of mail consisting of an upper metal shirt and a short metal skirt, and holding a sword in his hand. He sits on a saddle made out of a lion's skin, which enhanced the ferociousness and the cruelty of this act, probably recalling the lion skin garment of Heracles. With his right foot, he pushes quite fiercely on the genitals of a naked barbarian who, like the doomed unbelievers, falls upside down as if to hell. The barbarian is characterized by his extreme muscular body, curly hair, and curly long beard, all of which suggests his wild, untamed, and in turn uncivilized nature. I have not time here to elaborate more on the possibility of the iconography of this barbarian figure, and it is very likely that it was the image of the barbarian is actually inspired by the personification of rivers, and I'm thinking of the possibility of the personification of the Megerda River, which used to supply water to Carthage. And I just want to show you another copy of a medallion that we lost of Giovanni Bernardi, which has been done, the copy with gold leaf on a precious stone here, and it is located today in Krakow. And you can see in this image the image of Charles V. Again, I don't have the right glasses here to look, but it should be here. The same image on the lion skin saddle, and here you see the personification of the river of Carthago here, which looks quite the same. I would like, of course, to thank Anna Lebet, the curator from the Krakow, who sent me this image. The capture of Tunis was violent. As usual, during conquest, the city of Tunis was exposed to loot and aggression. Indeed, several scenes depicted in the drawing of Jan Cornelius Vermeyen and Herman Postumus, who saw these violent events with their own eyes, were fully recorded visually later, and even woven into large gobelins. Accounts of soldiers who took part in this expedition and account of eyewitnesses who reported on which they saw illustrate the misery inflicted on the city and its inhabitants during these days of raid. I would like also to thank my colleague Laura Henriksen, who collected these accounts and translated several of them into German and into English. It was part of her collective work on tracing looted manuscripts, and mainly Qurans, that were sacked by Charles V from Tunis, from the Zaytuna Mosque in 1535, and reached European libraries. So, for example, Nicolas Gouldin, a Swiss mercenary, informed us in a letter that he sent to Joachim Vadian, the mayor of St. Gallen in Switzerland, that the looted treasures, and I cite, were almost too much to carry. He mentioned that among the variety of merchandise which were looted onto the ships and taken back to Europe were jewels, precious stones, clothes, velvet, silk, and cotton, golden embroideries, bracelets, necklaces, and silver or gold and silver tableware. Antoine Perenins, the personal clerical assistant of Emperor Charles V, who accompanied him through his expedition from Barcelona to Tunis and later on his triumphal parades in the city, in Sicily and in Napoli, adds that in the mosque, and I cite, in the mosque and the temples of these Moors, they destroyed and broken libraries and books, which were many about their law. Beautiful gilded, bound and written in letters of gold and blue. Also, from some of these mosques, they took columns of gray jasper and other valuable stone. And though even written 100 years later in 1698, Ibn Abi Dinar, namely Abu Abdullah ibn Ruani al-Qayrawani, in his Kitab al-Muniz fi Akhbar Ifriqiya wa Tunis, tells us that during the second European invasion in 1573, the Great Mosque was desecrated and its libraries ransacked. The teaching of the scholars was put to shame by the feet of the unbelievers, and their scholarly collection were scattered. And they were scattered in the streets so that the passerby in the east of the mosque, where the Nawaring is today, could not walk without stepping on book. And the bells struck at the same time, and so he ends. Marius and other soldiers, who was eyewitness to the plunder of Tunis in 1535, speaks of looting, but also of the great profit made by selling slaves, and his account reads, I cite, the king of Tunis says, it is nothing to lose. I don't know what is going on. It's not clear to us what was the conversation, but there should be a conversation between the Charles V and the local Hafsid ruler. And the Hafsid ruler asked the king to kill everyone on July 23rd. And so the soldiers went to the city to plunder it. Many deeds that are usually done when taking a city is done. And for 2 days, almost the whole city was released to the spoils. Many from Tunis were captured or killed, and the soldiers were ordered to leave Tunis laden with booty. But it was the smaller booty that the soldiers had collected from all over the city. For there are more booty to be made from the sale of prisoners than from anything else. End of citation. These common practices and habits of plunder and pillage in moments of no central control and lack of regulating order are probably rooted in human greed and desire to gain quick financial benefits with no much payment involved. But how can one explain the atrocities and the wish to inflict pain and humiliation on the body of the conquered person? The particular scene, or rather say spectacle, of the clash between Charles V and the wounded barbarian encapsulate this attitude. And I say it now, something that I take from my colleague and friend Eric Michaud in his book, The Barbarian Invasion. And he said the rehabilitation of the concept of barbarians undoubtedly contained a justification of colonialization, of colonialism. He, Michaud, based his idea on the writing of Renan and Aimé Césaire. Michaud cites some actually illuminating passages from Renan, who has a sharp and harsh words on this idea of barbarization of the colonized. And Renan is saying colonization on a grand scale is a political necessity of the greatest importance. A nation that does not colonize is irrevocably on the path of socialism and to war between rich and poor. Conquest among equal races are to be deplored. However, the regeneration of the inferior and bastardized races by the superior races is part of the providential order of humanity. Very interesting. Yet, with this unexpected twist, Césaire keeps this line of thought by addressing the barbarianism of the colonizer rather than that of the colonized. Césaire said, and I cite him, colonization effectively decivilizes the colonizers, brutalizes them in the true sense of the term, defrages them, and wakes in them the buried instinct of greed, violence, racial hatred, moral relativism. There is ultimately this poison infused in the veins of Europe and the slow but sure progress of savagery throughout the continent. The Tunisian affairs of the Habsburg ended in 1574, circa 39 years after Charles V's arrival in Tunis in 1535. The Ottomans returned to Tunis, and the dream of Charles V to control the port city of Tunis and La Goulette and to revive memories of classical past of the illustrious city of Carthago, or Carthage, as the gate to Africa came to an end. Yes, as Gustave Flaubert wrote in a letter sent to Ernst Feydeau on November 29th or 30th, 1859. And this is quite interesting because the letter is sent exactly 1 year, 1.5 years actually, after Flaubert traveled in 1858 to Tunis in order to look at Carthage, for preparing material for his book, Salammbô. And I cite here from this letter of Flaubert, which I think would bring us also to the end of this lecture. And he says, "Few will be suspect how sad one had to be to undertake the resuscitation of Carthage." Thank you so much.
Thank you so much on behalf of all of us here for a very, very stimulating, exciting talk. I invite you to take a seat there. I invite the other speakers to join Professor Shalem up on the stage. And I actually take great pleasure inviting everyone here to a reception that is going to follow this series, which is going to take place at 5 o'clock, from 5 o'clock onwards, up in the Patrons Lounge, which is on the 4th floor of the back of the museum. We can give you directions, but it's the Patrons Lounge. So everyone is invited. You'll have a chance to interact with the speakers and ask them any questions that you want then. But in the few minutes that we have now, between now and the time that we leave for the Patrons Lounge, we are able to interact with them here. And especially for anyone who's not able to join us upstairs, this is your chance to ask any burning questions you might have. So over to all of you. There are microphones on the floor if anyone would like to start. And I'm going to join them there to moderate any questions that come up. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
I have a question. Why miniatures? Why does a society and a culture create a work of art in such a tiny form? And is this something that you see in other cultures too, in European or in Asian cultures? Or is it distinct to this area of the world?
Would like to take the question.
I mean, is this on? This on? Okay. I can answer that a little bit. I think, okay, to answer the first part of the question, why miniatures? I think in some sense it makes things in a way more understandable. It takes things that are maybe complicated. I think in ancient Egypt, in a way, it took this concept of death and it made it, something that's miniature, you can hold, you can move. It's maybe a little less scary. It's like when we're kids, if you look at, the dollhouse or the windows now you have in some shops in Manhattan full of these Lego miniatures, it takes something that's complicated and confusing and maybe chaotic, and it makes it very orderly, but in a three-dimensional sense. So I think miniaturization, on one level, that's certainly not the only one, can make things understandable, relatable, a little maybe more organized, especially with a concept like death, which is a kind of universal fear. So that may play some part in this for the Egyptians. But to answer your second part of your question, there is miniaturization in all different kinds of culture. You can go up to the Asian galleries, and they have miniature houses, also miniature stables, a whole range of miniature objects. And my colleague Joanne Pillsbury in the Rockefeller wing, it was more years ago probably than I think it was, she did an exhibition on domestic houses miniaturized in Mesoamerica. So I think it's a pretty widespread phenomenon of miniaturizing things, even to the present day.
Would anyone like to add a perspective?
I guess it is working. Thanks, Adela. I think I would just add to that there is, in fact, a great deal of miniaturization theory about why people do this. And it's kind of a very vast topic of scholarly interest, because it is something that I think, especially for those of us who study ancient worlds, we aren't going to know for sure. So we do need to come up with theories for that. So I think that is part of the focus.
You have to press something? No, I don't think so. Okay. I have not much to add to that, but maybe to make a clear distinction between the artisan and his desire to work and produce something so small, and the beholder and his experience in front of the object. So there are two different parts here to think of. From the part of the artisan, and also from the part of the patron who is giving this commission to do something like that, I think that one could say generally that it has to do with what would call bravura. The bravura is the idea that the artist could do something which is beyond any other work and shows by that his amazing work of art. And this is the idea of this minute, so that you have to work sometimes with a magnifying glass in order to do the work itself. The second one from the beholder is something that you already mentioned, the whole idea that we as children are doing the same with Puppet House and so on. It's part of, I think by the end, the possibility to control also. Yeah.
So, thank you all of you for these really inspiring talks. I have a question to Avinoam. So I enjoyed your two talks in a way. So the juxtaposition of Timur Lenk and his appreciation of artwork and Charles V's. But I accept that there are two ferocious conquerors, and there was the miniature. So where are the connections between both of these talks, which are in their juxtaposition fascinating?
Well, I just have to add, I have shown only one piece, which is such a small piece that was commissioned for the Conquest of Tunis by Charles V. But Charles V was doing, on the one hand, small cameos where, to monumentalize, small cameo, to monumentalize his capture of Tunis, and at the same time, monumental pieces to also monumentalize the capture of Tunis. So he works on both sides, and the Gobelins that we know, in Madrid or in Portugal or even, in Mechlin, in Belgium, are all evidence of this monumentalization. But on the other hand, he has also this idea of the small that is also monumental. Unfortunately, it seems, according to the anecdote that we hear here about Timur, that Timur was not interested in the small. He was interested in the big, and we know of this wish of Timur to create the huge and the big. I said it very, roughly, size matters to him. In that case, so maybe for him the small was, it was part of the less important. I'm asking myself always, why are we so easily, can kill a mosquito, but we are afraid of killing something bigger? I mean, so there is something about the small and the big that has to do with anthropology as well, and us as human beings.
So for the next Wilkinson lecture, we can do monumental.
Sorry?
We can do monumental for the next series.
I just wanted to add that miniatures evoke wonder. I mean, there is this kind of ajab effect that they have, and at least with me. And I wanted to ask Avinoam about the blue and gold Quran that was looted. Is that the famous blue Quran that is it possible that that's what it's referring to?
It's a wonderful question. When everyone in our field who is to encounter this evidence or this document about sacking blue and gold Qurans is asking, is it Fatimid now, the blue Quran that we have, or is it Abbasid? Is it something else? Is it Spanish? And we are back into the whole question of the blue and gold Quran. Now, don't forget that a blue and gold Quran could move from one place to another. I mean, it's not, the fact that they are sacked in Tunis does not say that they were made in North Africa. But it is interesting that we hear of someone who is a European and who is much impressed by this maybe blue parchment decorated with gold Qurans. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Otherwise, if not, I'll take this opportunity to thank our speakers for a very stimulating afternoon. Thanks to everyone who was involved in setting up this program. And a warm invitation to all of you and all of us to go up to the Patrons Lounge, where we can interact together and spend time with our speakers. The Patrons Lounge, again, is located on the 4th floor of this building. Well, not quite this building. You'd have to go across the Petrie Court and take the elevators there up to the 4th floor, and you can ask people for directions if you get lost. But we can also, groups of us, just walk up there together, and my colleagues and I can meet some of you in the back and set off together. So thank you. It's been a wonderful afternoon in honor of Wilkinson, Professor Wilkinson, and thank you again to all of our speakers.
Thank you, Navina.